Hazel Brooks held a bouquet of white roses that were losing their life. She stood by the altar of Trinity Church in Newport, Rhode Island, watching the petals turn brown at the edges as the minutes passed. 300 guests sat in the long wooden pews, their quiet voices filling the room like smoke rising toward the ceiling. They had all come to see the wedding of the year, but the groom was nowhere to be found. Her mother stood nearby, trying to smile while her hands shook, whispering that the traffic from Boston must be bad. Her father looked pale, his eyes fixed on the floor as the minutes passed by without any sign of Caleb. Hazel kept her back straight and refused to cry in front of the crowd, even though she could hear the cruel jokes starting in the back rows. The heavy wooden doors of the church opened with a loud creak, and everyone turned around expecting to see Caleb running in with an excuse. Instead, a tall man stepped into the light, looking like a winter storm dressed in black. It was Gideon Drake, Caleb's older brother, a man the town whispered about because of his strange lifestyle, his bone-white hair, and skin as pale as snow. He walked down the aisle with slow, deliberate steps, his dark eyes fixed entirely on Hazel as the room went completely silent. He stopped right in front of her, bringing a sudden chill into the air that made her shiver despite the heat of the candles. Gideon looked down at her with a face that showed no emotion, his white hair contrasting sharply with his black suit. "He is not coming, Hazel," Gideon said, his voice low and clear enough to cut through the silence of the church. He told her that Caleb had taken a train to New York and left for Europe, leaving a brief note that he could not go through with the marriage. The guests behind them began to whisper loudly, a wave of shock rolling through the pews as Hazel felt her knees go weak. Gideon reached out and caught her elbows with cold, strong hands, holding her steady before she could fall to the stone floor. He told her to breathe, his dark eyes holding hers with a steady focus that kept her from completely losing her mind in front of the crowd. Gideon looked at the staring guests with a cold expression that made several people look away in fear, his voice dropping so only she could hear him. He explained that her family would be ruined by this scandal. Their debts would never be paid, and society would never let her forget this public humiliation. He told her that she had a choice to make right now, if she wanted to save her parents, and her own future from being destroyed. "Marry me instead," he whispered, his grip on her arms tightening just enough to let her know he was completely serious about his sudden proposal. "We can change this disaster into something else, and no one will ever dare to laugh at you again." Hazel stared at his pale face, trying to find any sign of a joke, but his eyes were steady and serious. She knew her father had borrowed a large amount of money to pay for this wedding, and leaving alone would mean total financial ruin for her family. She looked at her mother's tear-stained face in the front row, then looked back at the white-haired man, who was offering her a sudden way out. She asked him what kind of life they would have, and he replied that it would be a quiet arrangement where she would want for nothing. With a final breath, she nodded her head and agreed to marry the mysterious brother who felt more like a creature of the night than a man. The priest stumbled through the words of the ceremony, his hands shaking as he adjusted the marriage certificate to change the groom's name from Caleb to Gideon. Gideon stood beside her like a statue, his cool presence acting as a strange anchor while she repeated the vows in a daze. When he placed a heavy platinum ring with a dark sapphire on her finger, his skin felt like ice against her warm hand, sending a shiver down her spine. He leaned down and pressed a brief formal kiss to her cheek, his lips barely touching her skin before he pulled away. The guests watched in total disbelief as the priest finally pronounced them husband and wife, completing the strangest wedding Newport had ever seen. The reception that followed at the local hotel was short and quiet, as most guests were too shocked to speak normally. Hazel smiled until her face felt stiff, accepting words of congratulations from people who looked at Gideon with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Gideon stayed right by her side the entire time, his cold hand resting lightly against her waist as he turned away anyone who asked about his brother. He did not eat any of the wedding cake or drink the champagne, choosing instead to watch the room with a sharp, protective gaze. Hazel noticed that people kept their distance from him, treating him like a predator that had suddenly walked into a crowded room. "They are all staring at us," Hazel whispered to him when they had a moment alone near the window. Gideon did not look at the crowd, keeping his eyes on the dark ocean outside as the sun began to set. "Let them look," he replied quietly, his voice smooth and steady. "By tomorrow, they will create stories to explain why you married the older brother instead of the younger one. Let them believe whatever story makes them sleep better at night, because the truth does not belong to them." Before she could ask what he meant, her parents approached them to say goodbye, their faces showing a mix of intense relief and lingering confusion. The black car moved smoothly through the dark streets of Newport, carrying Hazel away from her old life and toward the cliffs where the Drake family lived. Gideon sat across from her in the deep leather seat, his long legs stretched out and his gaze fixed on the moonlit trees passing by. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the quiet hum of the engine and the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the rocks below. Hazel looked at her new husband, noting how his white hair seemed to glow in the dim light of the car. He looked entirely different from Caleb, who had been full of loud laughter and easy smiles that turned out to mean nothing at all. "May I ask you a question?" Hazel said, breaking the silence as she twisted the sapphire ring on her finger. Gideon turned his head slowly, his dark eyes reflecting the faint green light from the dashboard. "You may ask," he said, his face remaining perfectly still, "though I cannot promise you will like the answer." Hazel took a deep breath and asked him how he managed to arrive at the church at the exact moment her wedding was falling apart. Gideon looked back out the window, his jaw tightening slightly. "I keep a close watch on my brother," he said simply. "I knew his nature, and I knew he was not ready for the commitment he promised you." The car finally stopped in front of a massive stone house that stood on the edge of a high cliff overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Shadowcrest Mansion was built from dark gray stone, with tall windows that glittered with faint candlelight against the black night sky. A row of servants stood waiting near the front doors, their heads bowed as Gideon helped Hazel out of the car. His hand was still remarkably cold, but his grip was firm and steady as he guided her up the stone steps. Hazel felt small beneath the towering arches of the entrance hall, where the floors were made of polished black marble that reflected their shadows. A tall woman with gray hair stepped forward from the line of servants, her black dress rustling softly against the floor. "Welcome home, ma'am," she said, her voice formal but polite. "I am Mrs. Weaver, the housekeeper here." Gideon nodded to the woman and told her to show Hazel to her rooms, explaining that his wife had suffered a long and exhausting day. He turned to Hazel and told her that he would sleep in the east wing of the house, leaving her with total privacy in her new quarters. He wished her a good night and walked away down a long, dark hallway before she could even thank him for the welcome. Mrs. Weaver led Hazel up a grand staircase made of carved wood, leading her to a spacious suite of rooms at the end of the hall. The bedroom was beautiful, featuring a large bed with dark green velvet curtains and a fireplace where a warm fire was already burning brightly. A young maid with red hair was waiting inside, bowing deeply as Hazel entered the room. "I am Ruby, your personal maid," the girl said with a shy smile. "His Grace ordered me to ensure you have everything you need tonight." Hazel thanked her and sat down on the edge of the bed, feeling the soft silk sheets beneath her hands. Hazel walked into the adjoining dressing room and stopped when she saw a beautiful dress hanging against the wardrobe door. It was made of deep green velvet, with fine silver embroidery around the collar that looked like tiny leaves. She touched the soft fabric and realized it was brand new, tailored to fit her exact measurements perfectly. "Where did this dress come from?" Hazel asked, turning to look at Ruby, who was preparing a hot bath in the next room. Ruby looked up with a knowing smile. "His Grace had that made for you last week, ma'am," the maid replied. "He said you would need something comfortable to wear after the wedding." Hazel felt a strange chill run down her spine as she realized the truth of Ruby's words. Gideon had ordered a custom dress for her days before Caleb had even run away from the wedding. She realized that her new husband had known exactly what was going to happen long before she stood alone at the altar. She sat in the warm bathwater, letting the heat wash away the tension in her muscles while her mind raced with questions about Gideon Drake. He was a man who lived in the shadows, who moved with unnatural grace, and who seemed to predict the future with perfect accuracy. She wondered what kind of bargain she had truly made to save her family from ruin. The next morning arrived with a clear blue sky and the crisp smell of the ocean air drifting through the open windows. Ruby entered the room at 9 o'clock, carrying a silver tray with hot tea, fresh fruit, and a small glass of dark red juice. She informed Hazel that the grandmother of the house, Mrs. Ida Drake, wished to see her in the sunroom at 11 o'clock. Hazel finished her breakfast quickly and dressed in a simple light blue gown that she found in the wardrobe. She felt nervous about meeting the older woman, knowing that the Drake family held a reputation for being difficult and reclusive. Hazel found the sunroom at the back of the mansion, where large glass walls looked out over a stone terrace and the ocean beyond. An elderly woman sat in a high-backed chair, her white hair piled neatly on top of her head, and a heavy wool blanket over her knees. She had the same dark, piercing eyes as Gideon, and she looked Hazel up and down with a sharp gaze that made Hazel stand up straighter. "So, you are the girl Caleb left behind," the old woman said, her voice surprisingly strong for her age. "Sit down, child. Let me look at you properly." Hazel sat in the white chair across from her, keeping her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I am Hazel," she said quietly. "I know who you are," Ida replied, a small smile appearing on her pale lips. "My grandson Gideon does not make impulsive decisions. When he told me he was going to marry you, I was shocked, but I see now that he had his reasons." Hazel looked down at her hands. "He did it to save my family from the scandal," she whispered. Ida laughed, a dry sound that echoed in the quiet room. "Gideon does not care about society or scandals, my dear. He did it for himself." Ida leaned forward, her dark eyes softening slightly as she spoke about her grandson. She explained that Gideon had lived a lonely life for over 2 decades, keeping himself hidden away from the world and never letting anyone get close to him. She told Hazel that Gideon had watched her from a distance for months during Caleb's courtship, noticing how she stayed kind and patient despite Caleb's constant neglect. "He saw something in you that cracked the ice around his heart," Ida said softly. "He knew Caleb would fail you, and he made sure he was ready to step in when the time came." After her conversation with Ida, Hazel spent the afternoon exploring the massive mansion, walking through long galleries filled with old paintings of the Drake family. She noticed that many of the faces in the portraits looked exactly like Gideon, spanning back over 100 years with the same white hair and pale skin. The thought was strange, but she brushed it away, telling herself that strong family traits were common in old lineages. As she walked, she noticed small details that made her stop and think. Every room she entered was perfectly warm, with a fresh fire burning in the grate just before she arrived. She found a small book of poetry sitting on a side table in the library, with a silk ribbon marking a page she had mentioned loving weeks ago. On her tea tray that afternoon, the kitchen had prepared the exact lemon biscuits she preferred, even though she had never told anyone in the house about her tastes. She began to realize that Gideon was watching her habits with incredible detail, providing for her comfort, without ever demanding her attention or thanks. He remained a shadow in the house, disappearing before dawn and only returning to his study late at night, when the rest of the world was asleep. Hazel decided to wait for him that evening, sitting in a chair near the grand staircase until the clock struck midnight. She heard the front door open softly, and Gideon stepped into the hall, his white hair damp from the ocean fog outside. He stopped when he saw her sitting there, his dark eyes widening slightly in surprise before his face went blank again. "You should be asleep, Hazel," he said, his voice low and cool in the quiet night. "The house gets cold at this hour." Hazel stood up and walked toward him, stopping a few feet away from his towering frame. "I wanted to thank you," Hazel said, looking up into his pale face, "for the books, the tea, and everything you have done to make me feel welcome here." Gideon looked down at her, his expression remaining unreadable in the shadows of the hall. "You are my wife," he said simply. "It is my duty to ensure you are comfortable in this house." Hazel shook her head slightly. "It feels like more than duty, Gideon," she whispered. He did not answer, but he reached out and touched her cheek with his cold fingers, a gentle gesture that lasted only a second before he turned and disappeared into the darkness. 3 weeks passed in a quiet routine, and Hazel began to feel a strange sense of peace within the stone walls of Shadowcrest Mansion. She spent her days reading in the library, walking along the cliff paths, and talking with Ida, who became a comforting presence in her life. Her father had written to her from Boston, confirming that all their family debts had been paid in full by an anonymous banker in Newport. Hazel knew the money came from Gideon, and the knowledge made her heart swell with a warmth she had never felt during her long engagement to Caleb. One rainy evening, Hazel walked into the library and found Gideon sitting at the large mahogany desk, surrounded by stacks of old books and financial ledgers. He was holding a glass filled with a dark red liquid, his white hair catching the yellow light from the desk lamp. He looked tired, with faint dark circles beneath his eyes that made his pale skin look almost translucent in the shadows. He did not look up when she entered, but he set his glass down and closed the book he was reading with a soft thud. "I did not mean to interrupt your work," Hazel said, stopping near the large stone fireplace where the logs were crackling loudly. Gideon sighed softly and rubbed his temples with his long, pale fingers. "You are not interrupting, Hazel. Please, sit down." She took the leather chair across from his desk, pulling her green shawl tighter around her shoulders against the draft. "You work very late every night," she observed, looking at the endless rows of figures on his papers. "The night is the only time I can truly think," he replied, his voice carrying a deep weariness. Hazel leaned forward, her eyes fixed on his steady face. "My father wrote to me," she said softly. "He told me the debts are gone. I know it was you. Gideon." Gideon looked at her then, his dark eyes catching the firelight in a way that made them look almost red for a brief moment. "It was part of our agreement," he said coldly, though his fingers twitched against the desk. "I told you your family would be provided for. I always keep my promises. But why did you do it?" Hazel pressed, wanting to break through his icy exterior. "You did not owe me anything." Gideon rose from his chair and walked to the large window, looking out at the rain pouring against the glass. "I watched you for 6 months, Hazel," he said, his back turned to her. "I watched my brother treat you like an afterthought, leaving you alone at parties while he amused himself with others. I saw how you smiled through his carelessness, pretending it did not hurt you because you felt you had no choice." He turned around, his white hair stark against the dark window. "I envied him every single day because he had something precious and did not care enough to keep it safe." Hazel felt her breath catch in her throat as she listened to his rough, honest words. "Gideon," she whispered, rising from her chair to stand near him. "I am not good at speaking with people," he continued, looking down at her with a raw intensity that made her pulse quicken. "I have lived in the dark for a very long time, and I forgot how to be warm. But when I saw you standing at that altar, looking like your world had ended, I knew I could not let you walk away into a life of misery. I wanted to be the one to protect you, even if you never learned to love me in return." Hazel reached out and placed her small, warm hand over his cold fingers, feeling him stiffen at the sudden contact. "I don't think I need to learn, Gideon," she said softly, looking directly into his dark eyes. "You have been kinder to me in 3 weeks than Caleb was in 2 years. You don't have to hide in the dark anymore." Gideon stared at her hand on his jaw working as if he were trying to contain a powerful emotion. He did not pull away this time, his cold fingers slowly turning to wrap around hers with a gentle, protective pressure. "Good night, Hazel," he whispered, after a long moment of silence, his voice carrying a softness she had never heard before. He released her hand gently and walked out of the library, leaving her alone with the warmth of the fire. As she walked up the grand staircase to her room, she realized that the mysterious white-haired man she had married was not a monster to be feared. He was a lonely soul who had protected her from the storm, and she was beginning to realize that she wanted to stay by his side forever. The white envelope sat on the silver tray in the entrance hall, its surface marked with a heavy red wax seal. Hazel picked up and read the elegant handwriting aloud to Mrs. Weaver, who was supervising the cleaning of the mirrors. "Mrs. Montgomery requests the pleasure of our company at her annual winter ball this coming Saturday," Hazel said, feeling a sudden tightness in her chest. The Montgomery family belonged to the highest circle of Newport society, and their parties were always crowded with the very people who had witnessed her disaster at the church. You do not have to go, ma'am, Mrs. Weaver said gently, noticing the worry on the young woman's face. His Grace rarely attends these events anyway. Hazel shook her head, her jaw setting with a sudden determination. No, we must go, Mrs. Weaver. If I hide away in this mansion forever, people will think I am ashamed of my marriage. I want them to see that I am perfectly fine. Gideon entered the hall from his study, his white hair perfectly neat as always. If you wish to attend, Hazel, then we shall go together, he said firmly. The night of the ball arrived, and Shadowcrest Mansion was filled with the sound of movement, as Hazel prepared for the evening. Ruby helped her into a magnificent gown of midnight blue silk that shifted to silver whenever she walked under the light. The bodice was decorated with tiny crystals that looked like stars against the dark night sky, and the fabric flowed behind her like a gentle wave. Ruby fastened a heavy silver necklace around Hazel's neck, its large blue sapphires feeling cool against her skin. These belong to His Grace's mother, Ruby whispered with reverence. He insisted you wear them tonight. Hazel walked down the grand staircase, her silk skirts rustling softly against the dark wood steps. Gideon was waiting for her at the bottom, dressed a sharp black evening suit that made his pale skin and white hair look even more striking. He stopped and stared up at her as she descended, his dark eyes widening with an expression that made her cheeks turn pink. You look beautiful, Hazel, he said, his voice dropping to a low whisper as he offered her his arm. His touch was cool, but it felt solid and reassuring against her shaking hand. The Montgomery estate was ablaze with hundreds of yellow lights, and long lines of cars were dropping off the wealthy families of Rhode Island. As Hazel and Gideon walked through the grand entrance of the ballroom, a sudden wave of whispers washed over the crowd. People turned their heads to stare, their eyes moving from Hazel's sparkling jewels to Gideon's white hair and pale features. Hazel felt her heart beating fast against her ribs, but Gideon pressed her hand closer to his side, his steady presence keeping her grounded as they walked through the room. Just look at me, Hazel, Gideon murmured as the orchestra began to play a slow waltz near the center of the room. The rest of these people do not matter. He guided her onto the dance floor, moving with an unnatural smoothness that made it feel as though they were floating above the polished wood. Gideon held her firmly, his dark eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made the rest of the crowded ballroom disappear into a blur of color. For a few perfect minutes, Hazel forgot about the whispers and the stares, feeling completely safe in her husband's cool embrace. The music ended, and as they walked toward the edge of the floor to get a glass of water, the crowd suddenly parted in front of them. Hazel stopped dead in her tracks, her hand tightening against Gideon's arm as her face went completely pale. Caleb Drake stood a few feet away, looking thinner and more disheveled than he had 3 weeks ago, with a wealthy young woman named Chloe Albright standing at his side. Caleb's brown eyes were wide with a mixture of anger and regret as he looked at Hazel wearing his mother's family jewels. Hazel, Caleb said, his voice loud enough to attract the attention of the nearby guests, who immediately stopped talking to watch the confrontation. I see you did not waste any time replacing me with my brother. Gideon stepped forward immediately, his tall frame blocking Caleb from Hazel's sight as a dangerous chill filled the air around them. You chose to leave, Caleb, Gideon said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy whisper that made Caleb take a step back. You have no right to speak her name in this room or anywhere else. Leave us now! Caleb laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that drew even more people toward the circle that was forming around the two brothers. You think you are a hero, Gideon? Caleb shouted, his face turning red with anger as Chloe tried to pull his arm away. Tell her the truth about why you married her so quickly. Tell her about our father's will. Hazel felt a cold dread settle in her stomach as she looked from Caleb's furious face to Gideon, whose pale features had gone completely rigid under the bright lights of the chandelier. Our father left a condition on the estate, Hazel, Caleb sneered, pointing a finger at his older brother. Gideon had to marry before his 35th birthday, or forfeit half of the Drake family fortune to me. His birthday is next month. He did not marry you to save you, Hazel. He did it because you were a convenient bride who could save his precious inheritance from falling into my hands. The ballroom went completely silent as the words echoed through the space, and Hazel felt the floor tilt beneath her feet as the truth hit her like a physical blow. She looked up at Gideon, her eyes searching his pale face for a denial, but his dark eyes were fixed on the floor, his jaw clenched tightly. "Is it true, Gideon?" she whispered, her voice cracking with a sudden pain that felt sharper than Caleb's original abandonment. "Did you need to marry before your birthday?" Gideon looked up at her, his eyes filled with a desperate sadness that she had never seen before. "Yes, Hazel, the condition is true," he said softly, reaching out a cold hand toward her. "But, please, let me explain the rest of it." Hazel stepped back, pulling away from his touch as the tears finally spilled over her eyelashes and ran down her cheeks. She felt foolish and completely humiliated all over any time, realizing that she had simply moved from one brother's game to another's legal strategy. Without another word, she turned and ran through the crowd of staring guests, ignoring her mother's voice calling out to her from the edge of the room. She ran out into the cold night air, finding their driver waiting by the car and ordering him to take her back to the mansion immediately. She locked herself at her bedroom the moment she arrived at Shadowcrest Mansion, throwing the midnight blue gown onto the floor and burying her face in the pillows. For 3 days, Hazel refused to leave her room, sending back every tray of food that Ruby brought to her door and ignoring the quiet knocks that came every evening at midnight. She felt completely broken, realizing that the small kindnesses and thoughtful gifts had probably been a calculated plan to keep her happy until the legal papers were signed. She felt more alone in the massive stone house than she ever had in her life. On the 4th morning, Ruby entered the room quietly and set a single white letter on the bedside table next to Hazel's hand. "His Grace left this for you, ma'am," Ruby said softly, her voice filled with a deep sadness for the young Duchess. "He has packed his bags and left for the city house in Boston. He told me to tell you that if you wish to leave, he will provide you with a full settlement and will never bother you again." Hazel waited until Ruby left the room before she picked up the paper, her fingers shaking as she broke the black wax seal. "Hazel," the letter began in Gideon's sharp, elegant handwriting. "Caleb told you the truth about the will, but he did not tell you the choices I made. The deadline was still months away, and I could have married any wealthy woman in society to save the fortune. I chose you because I loved you, long before Caleb ever ran away from that altar. I prepared the room and the dress because I knew Caleb was planning to leave you, and I wanted to ensure you had a safe place to go when your world fell apart. I should have told you about the money, but I was afraid you would think my feelings were fake. I am truly sorry for the pain I caused you." Hazel read the letter 3 times, her tears blurring the ink as she realized the true depth of Gideon's choices. She looked at the green velvet dress hanging in the wardrobe and remembered how he had ordered it a week before the wedding, long before he knew how she would react. He had not forced her into the marriage. He had offered her a lifeline when she was drowning in front of 300 people. He was willing to give up his inheritance and let her go with a full settlement just to ensure she was happy and free from his presence. She stood up from the bed and walked down the long hallway to the sunroom, finding Ida sitting by the glass wall with her usual wool blanket. The old woman looked up, her dark eyes seeing the letter in Hazel's hand immediately. "He is a fool, my grandson," Ida said quietly, shaking her head. "He spent 20 years hiding from the world because he was afraid of being rejected for what he is. When he finally found someone he wanted to keep, he handled it with the clumsiness of a man who has never been loved by anyone." "Where is he now, Ida?" Hazel asked, her voice steady for the first time in 3 days. Ida pointed out the window toward the high cliff path that led to the old stone garden at the edge of the property. "He did not go to Boston, child. He told the servants that to keep you calm, but he has been standing out there in the freezing rain since yesterday evening. He is waiting to see if you will look for him, or if he must live in the dark forever." Hazel turned and ran out of the sunroom, her boots clattering against the marble floors as she hurried toward the gardens. The winter wind was howling against the cliffs, throwing cold ocean spray into the air as Hazel walked down the stone path toward the old rose garden. The bushes were bare and covered in a light frost, their thorny branches twisting together like wild fences against the gray sky. Standing at the center of the garden was Gideon, his white hair soaked with rain and his black coat covered in a thin layer of sea salt. He looked thin and pale, his dark eyes fixed on the ocean below, as if he were waiting for the waves to swallow him whole. He turned around when he heard her footsteps on the gravel path, his eyes widening with a sudden, desperate hope that made him look completely human. "Hazel," he breathed, his voice cracking under the force of the cold wind, "you should not be out here in this weather. You will catch a chill." Hazel did not stop walking until she was standing right in front of him, looking up into his pale face with a soft smile. "You are a fool, Gideon Drake," she said quietly, reaching up to touch his cold, wet cheek with her warm hand. "I am sorry, Hazel," he whispered, closing his eyes against her touch as a single tear ran down his pale skin. "I should have told you everything from the start." Hazel shook her head and stepped closer, wrapping her arms around his waist and burying her face against his cold chest. "The money does not matter to me, Gideon," she said softly. "I know the truth now. You saved me because you cared, not because of a legal deadline. I don't want to leave this house, and I don't want to leave you." Gideon let out a long breath that looked like a cloud of white steam in the cold air, his arms coming around her to hold her tightly against him. He leaned down and kissed her, a deep, warm kiss that felt entirely different from the formal greeting he had given her at the church altar. Hazel felt the coldness of his skin melt away under the heat of their connection, realizing that she had found her true home in the arms of the white-haired king who lived on the cliffs. They stood together in the frozen garden, wrapped in each other's warmth, as the sun began to break through the dark clouds above the ocean. Spring arrived at Shadowcrest Mansion like a quiet blessing, turning the gray stone walls into a vibrant home filled with life and color. The old rose garden on the cliff exploded into bloom, with hundreds of pink and white flowers opening their petals to the warm sun. The dark mansion felt lighter now, with the windows thrown open to let the ocean breeze carry away the lingering chill of the long winter months. Hazel spent her mornings walking through the gardens with Gideon, whose pale skin seemed to soften under the gentle spring light as he walked by her side. Caleb and Chloe Albright had left Newport shortly after the ball, unable to face the high society families after Gideon officially secured the full inheritance. Ida Drake observed the changes in her house with a deep satisfaction, often sitting on the terrace to watch Hazel and Gideon talk near the rose bushes. The servants no longer walked with bowed heads and quiet whispers, their faces reflecting the new warmth that had settled into every corner of the old stone mansion. Gideon had even started to join Hazel for breakfast in the sunroom, drinking his red juice while listening to her plans for the estate. In early April, a small cream-colored envelope arrived on the silver tray, containing an invitation to a spring celebration at Trinity Church. Hazel looked at the paper with a thoughtful expression before showing it to Gideon, who was reading a book nearby. "We should go back to the church." "Gideon," she said softly, taking his hand in hers. "But this time I want us to stand at that altar by choice, not because we are trying to escape a disaster." Gideon looked at her with a gentle smile, his dark eyes shining with love. "Whatever you wish, my Duchess," he replied. The church looked entirely different on that warm spring afternoon, with the golden sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows and filling the pews with a bright, welcoming light. Her parents were there, looking happy and healthy with their lives completely restored, sitting next to Ida, who wore her finest black silk gown for the occasion. Hazel stood at the altar in her green velvet dress, looking up at Gideon, whose white hair caught the colored light from the window above them. Pastor John smiled at the couple, his hand steady as he opened his book to lead them through their new promises. "I, Hazel, take you, Gideon, to be my husband," she said, her voice clear and strong enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Not because I need a rescue from a scandal, and not because of a legal promise. I choose you because you showed me what real love looks like when the world was dark, and I want to spend the rest of my days walking in the light with you." Gideon's hand trembled slightly as he held hers, his pale skin looking bright under the sun as he spoke his own vows to the woman who had saved him from his long loneliness. "I, Gideon, take you, Hazel, to be my wife," he whispered, his voice carrying a deep emotion that made several people in the front rows wipe their eyes with white handkerchiefs. You brought warmth into a house that had been frozen for 20 years, and you showed me that I did not have to hide in the shadows anymore. I promise to protect you, to honor you, and to love you through every season that comes our way." He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, lingering promise that brought a loud cheer from the servants standing in the back of the church. Later that evening, they stood on the terrace of Shadowcrest Mansion, watching the moon rise over the quiet waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Hazel leaned her head against Gideon's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath his coat as the cool night air began to move through the trees. She looked down at the dark sapphire ring on her finger, realizing that the worst day of her life had actually been the start of the best story she could have ever written for herself. They had walked through the winter storm together, and now they had a lifetime of spring waiting for them on the cliffs. Sitting by the window as the stars come out over the water, I find myself looking toward the years ahead with a quiet sense of peace that I never expected to feel. It is strange how the mind tries to plan every detail of life, building stories about what the future should look like, only to have those plans shattered in a single afternoon. We spend so much time fearing the disasters and running away from the moments that humiliate us, thinking that a broken promise means the end of our happiness. But the dark rooms and the silent hallways of this house have taught me that sometimes the things we think will destroy us are simply the doors opening to where we truly belong. Love does not always arrive with loud declarations or perfect circumstances under the morning sun. Sometimes it comes as a shadow that stands between you and the crowd when you have nothing left to give. It is found in the quiet choices made in the dark, in the patience of a man who listens to your habits, and in the willingness to stay when everything else has fallen apart. Gideon and I did not start our life with a traditional fairy tale, but the vows we spoke in the quiet library and under the bare branches of the winter garden are far stronger than any words spoken in a crowd. As the ocean waves continue to crash against the rocks below, I know that the winter is finally behind us, and the future we are building together is worth every single tear it took to get here.